Good morning. Thank you very much for turning out and hopefully trying to explain Egypt. I have to say, as Charles was mentioning, I used to be in the city but moved to the region quite a long time ago. And it's quite interesting. I've never, in all my period of looking at the region since the early 90s at Barings, that being asked to explain Western policy, especially in the last year, but then again trying to explain more recent issues, such as hung Parliament are easy. But in the case of strange figures on the platform with our Prime Minister, I couldn't explain. So it's quite interesting that the level of interest in what is happening in the region for the West is quite interesting. And perhaps Charles, we can talk about this. And I have to say thank you to Beasley for these discussions. I find that increasingly there is interest in the region and in investments now coming into the West. But of course, you were looking at the region and trying to explain Egypt today. Now, I bring this up quite a lot, and Charles and the team will know this. And I think Beasley, at the last talk, we also mentioned this about 2 years ago. If I mention the Belgian ambassador, when he left recently, said over a lunch that the growth in the population of Egypt in his tenure as ambassador became the equivalent of the population of Belgium. Shows you the level of increase in population, which 20 years ago was 1.2% per annum, is now 2.5% per annum. And of course, in a time of shortage of natural resources, particularly with water, this is important. And I'll come back to that at the very end, obviously in terms of climate change too. Now, we've had, since 2011, as you know, significant political change, both at the beginning of 2011 and the summer of 2013. And as a result, internal investment and external investment into Egypt diminished. What we have seen, however, over the last year and a half to 2 years is the beginning of a change of better management of the economy, at last. And it's taken a very long time to begin to stabilize, even before the president took office, when he was behind the scenes from 2013. There was flip-flopping in policy. And it's really only since the devaluation of the currency last year that we now see real change, real focus, some coordination of policy between ministries at last. However, on the street, the population's not feeling it. It's still tough. When economic growth has been running about between 3 and 4% per annum, to many countries that would be pretty good, but in a country like Egypt, you need much higher levels of growth, probably near double figures, to be able to make up for the uncertainty of the last few years. And then on the street, when inflation is high, and we'll come to that, people in the street are hurting. So there's still pressure for the government to perform much, much better. However, let's step back a little and try and look at some of the macro features here. I have to say, of all of the countries in the MENA region, Egypt has one of the most diversified economies, both in terms of what it produces and in terms of its exports and imports. And the changes in the last 2 years, and especially since the devaluation, we're seeing a growth now in different forms of exports and import substitution. But clearly here you see the importance of the European Union and the UK, which make up about 1/3 of both imports and exports. And clearly, as some of you know, in the oil and gas sector here, you are aware that Egypt now is at last again focusing and improving its oil and gas sector, helped very much by the fact that Sheriff Ismail, the Prime Minister, is a former Minister of Petroleum, and with someone also, Tariq Mullah, who's running the Ministry of Petroleum, running the ministry far, far better than I think any time that I've seen since I started covering Egypt. So I think for those of you in the sector, you will have, I think, greater comfort from the knowledge that it's being managed better, it's much more transparent, and I think much more mature, although problems on a day-to-day basis do tend to exist. So some of the other macro features. Clearly, last year, when the IMF was brought in for the extended fund facility of $12 billion, the government, one of the key features which the IMF was focusing on was improving the fiscal picture. As you see here, the budget deficit is dreadful, truly dreadful. Much of that given from subsidies, increasing population, and this is in fuel and food subsidies particularly, and to state-owned enterprises. The IMF has focused on this to try to say you have to bring down the budget deficit in the next year to below 10% of GDP. And frankly, actually, we're beginning to see improvements in the budget deficit as the government is focusing on cutting subsidies. We already saw in 2014 a cut on the fuel subsidy. We saw it again in other subsidies late last year. In July, next month, there will be an announcement we expect to cut fuel subsidies further. They have to be cut for the budget deficit to continue to fall. We're also going to see changes to water pricing at last. Those of you who cover the region know that there isn't one country that charges a realistic price for water anywhere in the region, the Middle East, North Africa. So fuel subsidy cuts, electricity subsidy cuts, both of those will be painful and will be to an extent reflected in a bit of a jump again in inflation. But it's getting better in terms of the overall budget picture, helped by introduction of VAT. Other macro pictures, loans in local currency, actually nothing too much really to worry about here in terms of growth. In a country that's relatively unbanked, between 10 and 11% of the adult population have bank accounts, an enormous informal economy, very cash rich economy. And I should say here, in a world full of debt, Egypt, frankly, from the private perspective, is almost a paragon of virtue. And that is because the private sector debt as percent of GDP is below 20% equivalent, and household sector debt below 10% of GDP. And here, of course, it's well over 100%. So clearly also that leaves growth for any of you in the financial services sector, growth in the financial services sector for the future. But this is slightly different, and it's interesting. When I had the IMF to dinner recently, the IMF team, they brought this up. This growth in foreign currency loans is one of the reasons why they were pressing for an increase in interest rates, which the market didn't like a few weeks ago. When the interest rates rose by 2%. They're up about 5% in the last year and a half. And they say that this has to be brought under control. Well, part of this is actually growth in loans in Egypt are being driven not for consumption, but for working capital. And this rise, as you know, is almost coincident with the devaluation because people have mortgages, university payments, companies having to pay for goods overseas that are being imported. So this isn't a surprise. So I'm surprised by the argument, the intellectual argument that the IMF is using to raise rates. I disagree with it totally. And they know it, and along with others in the market. But this is one of the reasons why they decided to raise interest rates. There'll be another meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee shortly. I don't expect them to make changes to interest rates. So here we have total domestic debt, where you see this rise of government issuing debt within Egypt. And the banking sector becoming a little bit like, not quite, but like the Lebanese banking system that's basically making money from the difference between its loans and what it receives from interest from government debt. It's a lazy form of banking, very profitable too, but not solid for the long term. So this has to be brought under control. We might see, though, in the short term to medium term, a continued rise, though, in domestic debt, but it's at painful levels because in 2011 it was about 70% of GDP, and it's now just about 100% of GDP. External debt, too, is rising because of loans it's received from the Gulf and now the IMF. And this so far is not a worry. It's about 30% of total debt, but it's growing. But it's a cheaper form of payment back for the government. And of course, the the debt issuances internationally. We might see another toward the end of the year, another Eurobond. They've been successful. Of course, in a world where the debt markets are very quiet in terms of returns, Egypt provides a very profitable return. So it's not a surprise that the Eurobond is able to be successful. And total investment and total savings, a bit flat. This has to change for the economy to grow. I want to spend a little time on this. I don't know, many of you, if you've covered Egypt, will know that inflation is stubbornly high. For all of the period I've looked at the region, which is now about 25 years, Egypt has had well above the global norm for inflation. It's internal inefficiencies. It's the problems of the internal market, problems of food particularly, a very inefficient agricultural sector, bad distribution, and bad food retailing, very primitive to extent. It's only recently, in the last few years, that food retailers have come in, like Carrefour and Spinneys from the Gulf. They're beginning to have an effect through the opening of the superstores. But inflation remains stubbornly high, of course, given a kicker by the devaluation at the end of last year. There'll be an extra pressure on this, and a kicker too from the cuts in subsidies. We'll have a little bit more of this after July. You'll probably see it in the August and September numbers year on year before the base effect kicks in and inflation stabilizes towards the end of the year. But for the average person, inflation is exceptionally painful. Here in Britain, inflation, I think it's about, somebody told me it's about 3%, 2 or 3%, and you consider that painful. Well, imagine if you're on this basically earning around $200 or $300 a month, and inflation's running at 30%, and food price inflation around 40% year on year. That is politically toxic. And here we have inflation and interest rates. This is where we have basically move up in the interest rates, where we disagreed with the IMF. Because of this, as we said already, the growth in credit in the markets and inflation isn't driven by consumption. Quite different. And we can perhaps talk about this separately on a briefing perhaps in the future, go into some of this in depth with Charles and his team, or with through Beasley. Now here we are. You can see clearly the exchange rate, which had been managed for a long time. A year ago now, the central bank governor went on television and said that the policy of maintaining a strong Egyptian pound was a wrong policy. And we thought, oh, that's good news. There's going to be a devaluation, although it's far better if he'd acted first rather than talk about it. Because what he did, and it was a mistake, led to the growth of the informal market, which was already there, but became much more apparent soon after, and basically moved out of the central bank control. They tried to do what they could by limiting the Foreign Exchange Bureau quite heavy-handedly. But the end result was that there was pressure, increasing pressure on the government and the president and the central bank to act. And last July, August, discussions restarted formally with the IMF to bring around the extended fund facility of $12 billion, and the devaluation happened. So the currency moved from, as you see here, about 9 up to and just over at 1.20 Egyptian pounds to the dollar. And we've had some slight movement, but stabilization in the last few months. And I have to say, when I see quite a number of debt and equity fund managers coming into Cairo, they're asking a question. I don't know if there's a laser here, but at the end, this almost stable exchange rate, when we've had changes to interest rates and various other figures, why is that the case? And we have to say there's probably a little bit of pressure internally not to move the currency beyond 20 to the dollar. And I have to say that this isn't really a question. If you get to see them, I think there's going to be a trade mission from Egypt towards the end of the year with ministers. You can maybe put them on the spot, but maybe by then we'll have a freer exchange rate. It is meant to be a free-floating exchange rate, but as you can see, not quite. But it was a brave move, and I'm not taking anything away. What the central bank did, and the government did at the time last year, was a very brave move. It had to happen, but it should have been better managed. It should have been more elegantly managed than it was. And I have to say, I think when the economy is a little bit more stable, which it's becoming, I think we're going to see a change in the central bank governor. I won't say who I think will replace him, but he's being prepared. Now, the good news. Value-added tax. It's broadening the tax base. It's easy to collect within Egypt. It's definitely helping government revenues. That's pretty good in trying to make sure the government meets its budget deficit targets. The president announced a civil service law that is basically to control wages, increasing productivity. And what you'll do is you're seeing natural wastage across the 6 million, between 6 and 7 million Egyptian workers in working for the government. So that was important. We have very clear commitment now to cutting energy subsidies. I mentioned those. We'll see the second stage of the major part of that in July. If it doesn't happen, I'll be worried, frankly, because we won't meet the budget deficit targets. So we're going to see cuts in fuel subsidy, as I mentioned, and electricity subsidy. That will be painful, but what they're trying to do is making sure the poorest in society, there'll be no price increases for electricity for the very lowest users of electricity. It's only for people like me using air conditioners up to bigger companies that are going to be paying much more, which is fine. We obviously have had the floating of the Egyptian pound. That's important, albeit the slight management of it. An IMF-approved program, and interestingly, on the IMF last visit, they are incredibly sensitive about meeting people outside the central bank, Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Investment. And to my knowledge, they've only had about 3 meetings, and I think I was one of them when they came. They don't like speaking to the press. I think, though, once this new round of subsidies passes, they might become a little bit more amenable to discussing the program. But they are also very clear. They don't want it to be seen as an IMF program. They want it to be seen as an economic reform program from within Egypt, which the IMF is supporting. Also, there's an investment law. At last, it's taken years, frankly. Still needs to be tweaked. We're awaiting the executive regulations, which are really the important part of what this law means, which is how it's going to be implemented. Because of those of you who are familiar with Egypt, are aware that it's in the implementation that therein lies the problem of the ability to reform. Privatizations too are happening, a bit slow, I have to say, but some big ones coming, and some of those will be on the stock market, and that's very, very good, because it means we should expect good equity flows into the market, which will help the current account deficit. Arab African International Bank, pretty good bank, pretty well managed. Banque du Caire, quite less so, but it's a very large bank, still needs to make internal changes. But the privatization program of other state-owned enterprises will continue, including in the oil and gas sector. And so I like what I see, but they need to get on with it. And I do think where the drawback has been is not putting better people in place to manage those organizations. I think that's a weakness. And we're seeing rationalization in the food subsidies. This is not a cut for the average citizen that's very poor. There's many seats over here, if you need a seat, by the way, in the front row, if you want. That's pretty good news, because the government is making it clear they're not cutting food subsidies, but rationalising it, which means the smart card system, loading it with some more cash for the average citizen, and making sure that it's only going to those people who deserve it. There has been some discussion lately that if families have more than 4 children, they would not therefore receive food subsidies for any further children to try to control population growth. But the reform program has been underway since last November. It is working, it is positive, and has drawn some very significant interest from outside the country. And not just in the oil and gas sector. Gulf investors that have a different risk profile to Western investors have been coming in significantly, with, for example, Majid Al Futtaim from Dubai raising their investment in Egypt from $1.5 to $3 billion in shopping malls. Even for a United Kingdom, from one company, that would be significant investment. And we're seeing further investment into other sectors. In the pharmaceutical sector, we're seeing significant increase, at least in my bank and others, in the mergers and acquisition of looking at acquisitions into Egypt. So that's pretty good news. The private equity sector will take a little bit longer to pick up because of the repricing of assets, but it's looking much better than it was in the economy, than it was a year ago. As we see here, a rise in foreign direct investment. This is in the fiscal year finishing in a few days. So this is good news. Much of that, though, of course, then FDI comes in the oil and gas sector, but as I said, we're seeing investment in the pharmaceutical sector still, despite the problems in the pharma sector about the government payments, although they are improving. In the consumer sector, particularly, enormous interest in the consumer sector in Egypt, as well as other sectors. So I'm pretty bullish about FDI next year, assuming the program continues as it is, the reform program. And what we are seeing too is increased import substitution. I see this increasingly, especially in the food sector, which, however, there is some heavy-handedness at customs, where there are increased customs controls to try to limit imports into Egypt. And I'm aware that the European Union has complained to Egypt about breaking trade regulations about some of those controls. But we are seeing at last some improvement and cut of the trade deficit, but much more needs to be done because of this very significant import bill. There's been an improvement in energy and non-oil energy. This is incredibly important. As Egypt is improving the oil and gas climate, as companies like BP, Shell and others, Eni, have discovered assets onshore and offshore, it means that by the end of next year, the gas position in production in Egypt will have improved enormously, and into 2019, when we have a turning point of Egypt becoming potentially a gas exporter for the first time in some years. So that is bullish. If Egypt can hold on and keep going without much internal dissent, if it keeps the body politic calm, the citizen calm, and inflation comes down, the fiscal picture will change dramatically from 2019 into 2020, and that's very important. But of course, we still need further improvements in the oil and gas sector, but it does create a dramatically different fiscal picture for Egypt that won't need to import any gas. And other good news, albeit it's coming from a very low base, tourism numbers up about 45% year on year. Pretty good news. Some seats down the front, very good, but revenues from tourism up only about 7% year on year because hotel prices have been cut. So we need to see some improvement in revenue generation from tourism, but it's recovering. But part of the problem of tourism, which has been historically important in Egypt, around 10% of the population in the tourism sector, is that capacity, airline capacity, hasn't improved. Up until very recently, for example, British Airways was flying only an A320, a very small plane, which was always full up. Now it's flying Dreamliners, again, which are full up. So capacity into Egypt is improving, but that's also demand for flights to London helped partly because the KLM flight has been cancelled for security reasons. So there has to be an improvement in airline capacity to Luxor and Aswan particularly, and of course Sharm el-Sheikh remains out of bounds for British tourists and for Russian tourists. So there's not going to be an improvement to the main tourist spot, but tourism in Hurghada and elsewhere has been improving. And any of you visiting Cairo will see that hotels are now running about 70 to 80% occupancy. And when these hotels only turn a profit about 25% occupancy, Cairo is actually pretty busy. And any of you going around will see now a return of tourism. Suez Canal revenue is flat. For the future, those of you involved in climate change will know that the threat comes in the future in about 30 to 40 years from ice-free Arctic. But so far, solid. But I don't really want to make very public remarks about the sensibility of expending $8 to $10 billion on new parts of the Suez Canal, but revenue is flat. Foreign exchange reserves rising. And interestingly, I need to mention at this point, the inflows, which are around $12 billion into the debt and equity markets since November have been put into a separate account in the central bank, as they did before. Historically, under a previous central bank governor, Farooq al he had a hidden reserve which wasn't known about until 2011, which helped provide stabilization for the foreign exchange reserves at the time, but it didn't last too long, given the amount of money going out of the country. Now we have all of that capital. Anybody putting money into the debt and equity markets, that capital is safe. So this is a rise from the other normal trading position in Egypt, and you see the effect from, as I mentioned already, from import substitution, growth in exports, which has been strong. So this is providing some solidity, and we saw only about a week ago, or just over a week ago, the removal of the limit of $100,000 for individuals to move out of the country. I haven't personally tested it yet, but I'd like to try when I go back, because it only happened, just as I said, before I left Cairo. But it's solid. So this is a really good picture, and this is providing, at least on a very macro level, support to show that things are changing in Egypt. And this is, as you see, a rise in interest in the domestic debt in the markets. But let me point to this, because as I mentioned, this is a mixed bag, I have to say. Egypt has a great ability to disappoint, a bit like the United Kingdom to an extent. But if you look at this, I'm a great believer in looking at the PMI, because it's the Purchasing Managers Index for Egypt. It's a very well-structured survey across hundreds of companies and across a variety of sectors, has remained stubbornly low now for over a year and a half. So the government needs to do much, much more to improve sentiment domestically. I mentioned a little earlier about bank loans. The banks are lending for working capital, not for investment so far. But there's been a little bit of improvement as they've added one new question on, do you expect the market to improve? But if the government doesn't do more to help change the belief that things are really changing for the domestic private sector, we're not going to have the growth that we require in Egypt to provide new jobs, because we're not seeing them. There hasn't been a growth in employment now for 2 years in the survey. So this really has to improve. But, as I mentioned already, people are believing that something is happening in Egypt. And as I showed you in the debt market, foreigners are coming back into the market in size in the last few months. And I have to say, I've now seen more investors in the last few months than I've seen in almost 7 years. And that's a really good sign. But looking ahead, what do we see? Very short-term executive regulations coming in the investment law. We hope they're good. They have to be good. Fuel subsidy cuts, which I mentioned. IPOs, sales of stakes in government-owned enterprises, they should happen in the autumn, and they can't happen soon enough. But let me just mention this. As you know, I haven't really talked about politics, and it's a bit difficult on a public forum talking about it. Presidential election next year. The President's office does seem to be already gearing up for the election next year. There are no alternative figures that are coming through the system so far. So it looks like he would win if he stands. I don't think anybody with any sense would stand against him, because they're not going to win. Perhaps we can talk about it after. Restructuring of the energy sector, I mentioned this. There's going to be changes in the regulation. All of it, I think, is going to be good. As I mentioned already, in all the sectors in Egypt, I have to say the financial service sector has tremendously good regulator. I like him very much, Sheriff Sani. Very, very good regulator. He wants good changes. He wants fintech. He wants new examples in the financial services sector and apps. So we're going to see good changes in the financial services sector actually in the next year or so. But the energy sector is the best managed of any sector because of the importance of that sector to the economy and the fact that those who are running it really know what they're doing at last. And the Prime Minister does. And the relations they have with companies in the sector have improved dramatically. There are problems in the implementation of change, as in anything in Egypt. It can be quite frustrating. But overall, I like the overall drift. both generally and specifically. I think it's pretty good news for that sector. But environment and climate change is, for me, when I studied economics, I also, at the time, because I didn't want to study accounting, although I had to come to it later, I changed for earth and environmental science. So the knowledge of that has been quite useful in the last few years. I think across the whole region, if Charles doesn't mind me just mentioning for a minute on across the region, I used to live in both Riyadh and Dubai, and I've covered the region now for 30 years. Life has changed in terms of the average temperature, and in the last month we've had about a week and a half of plus 40-degree temperatures, which have been unknown. Any of you looking at other countries in Spain, have seen peak temperatures too for this time of the year. Cape Town is almost out of water in South Africa. This region is enormously short of water, and for Egypt that is particularly important given that 98% of its water comes from outside its borders. And there's going to be stress from Ethiopia, where the main part of its water supply stems as the new Gur dam is completed at some stage, perhaps later this year or early next year. What that means for Lake Nasser, the evaporation of Lake Nasser in terms of water. But Egypt has to manage its water assets much more carefully because we already have ingress of salt water into the Nile Delta. I don't want to go into it too much right now, but it is, for me, an increasingly important part of the overall risk profile for Egypt, of what it means for both the provision of water and for what it means for the agricultural sector. Because if one had a week of, say, 50-degree temperatures, it would damage the agricultural sector significantly. However, if anybody is involved in the water sector, it does mean, of course, there's going to have to be very significant investment in the water sector, in wastewater management, potable water management, and in desalination, which we're not good at, but we're better in the technical aspects of it. And this is my final slide to put it in context. The growth in population, and I've looked a bit further out in the slide here. I've been a little bit conservative in the population numbers for next year and going out. But you see the blue line, the one that dips from the left, is water availability. The stress point was already reached 30 years ago. We're now down to about 640 cubic meters a year of water. And for me, this is vital. So you have to watch out for this in terms of what it means for the future, in terms of the environment, and across the whole region, where Saudi Arabia uses an incredible amount of its own energy for water desalination. So I now open for questions, if you have some questions. Thank you very much.